One time I was introduced like that, and somebody came up to me and said, I was expecting an old white-haired man to be standing up there. Well, I was traveling towards here, and I was on the plane from Halifax to Toronto, and sitting next to me was Phil Fontaine. And a lot of people came up and said hello to him, and then turned around and saw me as well and said hello. So we were kind of looking at each other, kind of curiously. Anyway, I was sitting there, and I got a brand new iPad, and I was trying to get my computer, my laptop to work, and then something went wrong. I think the battery just died. So I had to put my speech on a notebook, and I transferred it onto a paper. And so I'm going to read a little bit, then I'm going to go and take some asides, but loop me back in when I get too long-winded. Anyway, tonight I wanted to talk about the Indigenous notion of non-interference or avoidance behavior. In Indigenous society, in a traditional context, especially in ceremonies, it is prevalent in excuse me, traditional Mi'kmaq activities. The idea of avoidance. I'll grab somebody's wine here. Hype up my voice one level. In fact, I would go as far as saying that conflict resolution is one of the main philosophies in Indigenous cultures. Oral tradition maintains that a form of spiritual and physical equilibrium is important to keep the spirits of our ancestors at a peaceful relationship with us today. And we have to make sure that the future generations are left with a legacy of survival, healthy and strong. One of the early recorded activities of the Mi'kmaq spiritual chiefs, he was a healer, trying to heal some of his own people. And part of this function was to make sure that the spirits of the ancestors were kept informed about the activities of the healer and about the condition of the one that is sick. These recordings were made by Marc Lescarbot in the East Coast. They were also made by Pierre Bayard, who was a Jesuit who arrived in 1611. And other notices were made by missionary priests like Christian Leclerc and Abbe Maillard. So these examples are gleaned from some of those old chroniclers. So constant communication was maintained with the spirit world, either through dreams or just speaking to the spirits directly. The one that had been called upon to witness the healing process were also addressed. This was done by the healer by immersing his head in water, which was placed in a hole in the ground near the one that was sick. The healer stuck his head in, immersed his whole head in the water, and spoke to the spiritual ancestors. Once the healer heard the advice from the spirits, he had to acknowledge their presence by speaking to them, praying, then singing, drumming, and dancing for them, for helping him and the sick. Sometimes the healer was told to sing loud, drum loud, and dance hard, and even to shout loud to scare the evil spirit away from the sick person. The healer had the option of calling upon other healer elders to help. They would be brought into the place or the lodge, the wigwam, to witness the process of healing. These others could intervene when they felt it proper, but this intervention was done in a way not to offend the spiritual ancestors or the physical relatives present during the healing process, there were protocols to follow. When the patient, and I'm saying the sick person, looked like he was not getting better, then the spirits would be called upon to help in the process of death. Mi'kmaq people did not interfere with death. It is inevitable. And usually death would come. Sometimes it was hastened by pouring cold water on the chest of the patient in the middle of winter. This is one example of healing, a healing process which is done in balance with the spiritual world and the physical world. The Mi'kmaq did not try to stop death when it was inevitable. This is non-interference. Avoidance behavior comes into play today among our people when an expected conflict arises or a consequence, real or perceived. The tendency is to avoid sticky situations. For instance, if you knew that you were going to get punished by your parents for doing something wrong, you did not go home for a while or waited until everybody was asleep in the house. Then you went home. This behavior comes from survival instincts. We tend to avoid conflict as a natural behavior. And sometimes these conflictual behaviors tend to get us into worse situations in the context when young people don't want to go home anymore, or their assignments, or they didn't do their homework and they go to school and they don't want to face the teacher, and they would leave and not go home and not go back to school, and they'd end up roaming around in the reserve, in the community with brothers and sisters, uncles and aunts. And then you add alcohol and drug abuse into this situation, and all of a sudden you hear about suicides or deaths by young people in our communities that are hastened by alcohol and drug abuse. The tendency to avoid conflict comes from traditional practices. Talking circles, for example, sweat lodge ceremonies, pipe ceremonies, powwows or gatherings. Protocols are in place to avoid conflict. Using an eagle feather in talking circles avoids everyone talking all at once, because voices can be raised so that people can be heard in the din, and sometimes these highly raised voices get mistaken for anger. When speaking in a circle, you speak to the fire or the imaginary fire burning in the center of the circle. You do not address an individual directly in a circle, and you speak in the third person. For example, would that person wearing the yellow tie please return my shovel he borrowed 2 years ago? Avoiding conflict and anger. It gives time for that person to reflect and respond, and perhaps to apologize or bring back the shovel. One of the methods of conflict avoidance I heard when I was younger was when my great uncle, my maternal grandfather's brother, William Joe Simon, explained one fine day that the community, our community of Elsipogtog, was faced with a prospect of starvation in the late 1800s. The winter had been unusually warm and dry. The snow did not arrive, and it was mid-January. The expected moose and caribou did not migrate in the usual pattern. People in the community were starving, skin and bones. There were no fish, no meat, no Indian affairs. The headmen of 7 families in our community gathered to discuss their dilemma. The oldest told them to pick an old pine tree. We call it a chiguo, and the Ojibwe call it chingwa, and mark it with their axes and tie bright colored ribbons on it so that nobody will cut it in the future. The elder lit the sacred pipe and passed it around 4 times. Then 7 men had to form a circle around the pine tree and started to talk about their situation. the elder chief told the hunters that they will start speaking around in the circle, one by one, to find a solution to their problem. They will continue to speak until they come to a point when they all speak together. Only one voice will be heard. This is when we speak from the heart, one mind. One of the hunters said he could kill many rabbits, but there was no snow, so it was hard to track them on bare ground. Besides, he would have to kill hundreds of them to feed the whole community. Another hunter said he could kill many partridge, but they too were to be found far away, and it would take a lot of time. Another hunter said he could trap beaver, and he was told he would have to kill lots of them, which would take time as well, that they did not have. The hunters soon ran out of options. Finally, one hunter said that he heard from another visiting hunter only days ago that he has run into a big moose herd on the Salmon River near the Grand Lakes, about a day and a half's walk from the community. The other hunters joined in the chorus and agreed to go there to kill many moose to feed their families and community. Eventually, when they all spoke, they could hear only one voice. It was agreed. This was a mulgigaluswaan. They were going to go to the Salmon River salt springs and save their community from starvation. This was an actual situation, a true story, they would say today. We have other situations of community efforts, like the makusham among the Innu or Montagnier. It is a dance that involves the whole community, to feed the whole community among the Innu in Quebec and Labrador. When you see and experience this activity among the Innu, you appreciate the protocols involved in the relationships between the Innu and the caribou. There are many ceremonies to appease the spirits of the ancestors, the animals, and the ceremonies in treating the dead caribou, the skinning, the preparing of the meat for food, the bones, marrow, soups, and also everything concerning the feeding of the elders, the children, and the women. Usually the men were the ones who ate last. All this is done to avoid future conflicts with the caribou and the people's spirits. The communal goose hunt among the James Bay Cree is another example of the practice of ceremony to avoid future conflicts with the spirits of our ancestors and the spirits of the geese. The Plains Cree and the Blackfoot, they also have a buffalo hunt, a communal buffalo hunt, which involves lots of ceremony, dreaming, drumming, dancing before the hunt. And after the buffalo are killed, there are ceremonies conducted to feed the buffalo, to offer it tobacco, and sometimes to take the eyes out so the spirits of the buffalo do not see what we do to the animals. And so there are a lot of protocols in terms of disposing the bones and all the internal parts of the buffalo, because we rely heavily on these animals and birds and plants and fish for our food, our medicines, our clothing, our shelter, our tools of survival, how we travel about, and our relationship and negotiation with those spirits, our spiritual ceremonies. The Northwest Coast Indigenous people also are whalers. They fish for ulican and salmon, and all these are also, many ceremonies are encountered before the actual happening of the fish or the hunt. Elders, spiritual leaders are called upon to come and pray, to sing, to have the people dance to the spirits of the ancestors. And all this is part and partial to apologizing and keeping the spirits of the animals in a good state of mind. And so it was important for Indigenous peoples to go on when they go on a hunt, our elders tell us we don't exasperate the animal, we don't terrorize it, and we don't we always kind of like pretend to be a female moose and and the bull moose will come running to us, and when it turns around, it's offering itself for us to kill it. And the same with caribou. And I recall an instance when my grandmother and I was about 7, 8 years old, and we were snaring rabbits. And we had these brass snares we would tie and look for the path where the rabbit's gone through. And one morning when we were checking the snares, there was a rabbit sitting there. The snare was around its neck, but it somehow stopped and it didn't strangle itself. My grandmother says, "You stay there. When we come back, if you're still there, I'm going to let you go." And when we did come back, it was just sitting there almost like sleeping. And she grabbed it right away and pulled the wire off it and let it go. And so a lot of times too, when we're hunting, when an animal comes to us and turns around and walks away, usually we're not allowed out of protocol to shoot that or kill that animal because it didn't offer itself to us. Among the Inuit in the north, collaboration in communal hunts for caribou and seal and whales is also practiced, and it's important to understand that behavior, instinctual behavior in environmental situations. The stewards of the land versus poisoning the land with garbage. This is a reminder, I guess, for me to say, when I was working with the biodiversity issue with Environment Canada and the United Nations, some of the non-native people came up to me and said, I flew up the north and I went into Iqaluit and I went to such and such a community and I couldn't really help notice all the abandoned snowmobiles and old pickup trucks and old canoes and kayaks, the fiberglass and metal and aluminum stuff and glass everywhere. I thought you guys are supposed to be stewards of the land. I looked at them and I just kind of thought for a minute, stewards of the land. Isn't that a biblical European Christian concept that man is above birds, plants, animals, and fish? I said, I don't think we are the stewards of the land. We come from the land. We owe our existence from the land. We peeled ourselves from the land, so we are part of the land. And I said, talking about that garbage that's up in the north, it is a concept of indigenous ideology that has persisted for thousands of years. When Inuit or Northern Dene people leave a sled that's made out of wood and caribou antlers and sinew and leave it sitting there, or a kayak or a canoe made out of birch bark, over time Mother Nature will declare these elements back to herself. And somebody might come along and say, well, I could use that antler for my sled or something or other part of it. And so they would eventually disappear if it's left there 20, 30 years. But I said, those parts that come from the south, the aluminum kayaks or canoes, aluminum or plastic or Kevlar, these things, they don't disintegrate. Things that have metal nails in them, glass parts, those 45-gallon metal containers for oil, for the resource exploitation companies, they leave those things up there, I said. And so it's the idea that all that junk that's sent up north, they don't want it back in the south, and it gets left up there, and the indigenous people don't have the money to recycle it or to send it back, and so it gets left up there. And the ideology, a lot of indigenous people are not educated enough up there in the north or even in the south to know all the biodegradation, all the scientific terminologies about what happens to metal and plastic and glass and so on. So that's why you have that situation in the north and in some of the reserves in the south. These items, we have to figure out a way to now I have to get back to my notes because I had forgotten to write about another half a page of something I was supposed to say, and I said, maybe I will not use this. But after talking with John Burroughs last night, I am going to say it. This is not to say that there were never conflicts among Indigenous people. What I am advocating is that Indigenous cultures had a philosophy of reducing conflicts rather than advocating them. Environmental changes often forced Indigenous groups to head for higher ground or lower ground, depending on the nature of the disaster: floods, landslides, earthquakes, tsunamis, or even glaciers. In the process of escaping environmental consequences, Indigenous people encroached upon each other. There was more of a system of adaptation and accommodation than conflict or outright wars. Outright wars. Our people did not declare wars on each other for territories. They did not stockpile resources. Everybody comes from the land. We belong to the land. I just said this. We did not own it like real estate. It has often been judged by mainstream ideology that we owned the land and we had long histories of wars. We had notions of property ownership, and we knew that the treaties were for surrendering our land. This is where I think that we have to be careful in identifying an Indigenous perspective for resolving our conflicts. Even the notion of conflict resolution is not in our Indigenous languages. In a lot of instances, retrospectively, I have noticed that the Indigenous nations have been approached by government agencies to literally translate conflict resolution processes into Indigenous languages, literally for word. Like fitting a square peg into a round hole, this approach is inappropriate. No ceremony, no spirituality, and no Indigenous protocols. The talking circles will serve to reduce conflict. But all of you are not familiar with this process, and there will be tendencies to speak out of line. It requires a lot of patience, diplomacy, and avoiding trouble. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to my diatribe on avoidance and non-interference behavior, which is behaviors that are indigenous but have lasted over many, many years, and when we apply them to modern situations, they could have dire consequences. But in this process of reducing conflict, mediation, I think they can play a major role and a positive role in terms of finding a path for indigenous laws and mainstream processes. And that's been my interest, my hobby, up until now. And I would like to thank University of Western Ontario and Michael Coyle and Kawaskimhon. Meaning in our language, Kawaskimhon means you are giving information to that person to inform that person to have a more rounded vision, not to convince them to change their mind, but to incorporate in your ideas. Thank you.